I've produced a lot of Dual Force content, but this video is a little bit different. This is a sponsored video directly from the people behind DC Dual Force. What does that mean? Well, that means they want you, and I want you, to go down to the description and click on this sweet link and download DC Dual Force. This is the best time to be learning the game, so get downloading. And with that out of the way, let's jump into the ultimate intermediate guide for DC Dual Force. First things first, let's talk about combat. Recruits are made up of three important stats: the resource cost, the attack, and the defense. For the purposes of this section of the video, let's purely focus on the attack and defense of the card. Of these two stats, in general, I believe the defense value is significantly more important to a recruit than its attack value. That's not to say that an attack value is meaningless. There are certainly key points that you want your attack to be at. This isn't exactly the best way to evaluate this concept, but let's just take a quick look at the differences between what a one attack recruit can KO with a single attack versus what a two attack thing can KO with a single attack. And then obviously the two attack thing can KO everything that the one attack thing can, but look at how much the one attack recruit is missing out on. There's clearly a big difference between having one attack versus two attack, but that difference is substantially lower if you compare, say, a 6 attack thing and a 7 attack thing. There's still a difference. Having 7 attack is certainly better than having 6 attack, but that jump is significantly less important. All of that is just to say that if you have certain attack value thresholds, it can be really important for KOing specific recruits, but at the end of the day, the defense value is going to be more important in a wider range of scenarios. So just keep that in mind as you evaluate individual cards. Let's talk about card advantage. Card advantage is a simple concept. If I have more cards than my opponent, I have an advantage. But there are a lot of layers to card advantage, and not every game is going to come down to card advantage. It's just an important concept to understand. In general, you want to create scenarios that lead to your cards being worth 2 of your opponent's cards. Let's say, for example, we play Superboy, and to KO this Superboy, our opponent has to attack with 2 Victor Zsasz cards. Well, our Superboy went quote-unquote 2 for 1, and each of their Victor Zsasz went 0 for 1. Technically, that's not exactly how the math pans out. It's like 0.5 for 1, but for the purposes of this concept, there's no reason to go into that. Early game removal tools like Energy Blast are incredible at dealing with important threats, especially threats that grow over the course of the game. But in the very best of cases, a card like Energy Blast, these early game removal tools, will only ever go 1 for 1. So they peak out at just trading. That's okay, but 1 for 1 is about neutral. 2 for 1 is really good, and obviously 0 for 1 is quite bad. Now, obviously there's going to be situations where you need to go 0 for 1 in order to recover a certain board state, but just try to keep this broad concept in mind. You're only going to draw a certain number of cards per game, and if you start paying attention to which of your cards are more likely to go 2 for 1, it'll help you become a better deck builder, and it will help you become a better Dual Force player in general. Action economy. Action economy is not really a concept you need to think about in most card games, but it's extremely important to Dual Force. What is action economy? Well, I'm going to stop using the term action for the rest of this explanation because there's a type of card in Dual Force referred to as action, but simply put, there's only a certain number of things we can do each turn. With the exception of free cards and cards that generate extra resources, we can only play 2 cards per turn. Dual Force's resource system caps out at 1 gold, 1 silver on turn 5, but up until that point, we're limited to specific resource types each turn. From turns 1 until turn 4, we have the ability to play 7 cards. We can play 4 bronze cards and 3 silver cards. It's important that we take advantage of these 7 opportunities to play cards, because if we don't take advantage of those 7 opportunities and our opponent does take advantage of those 7 opportunities, it's going to be really hard for us to fight back onto the board without some very high value cards that are able to swing the board in some way. Obviously, this evaluation is a little more complicated than I'm giving it credit. There's things like leader abilities to keep in mind. That doesn't mean you have to play a card for each of these opportunities that the game gives you. There are certainly tons of situations where it won't be appropriate to play a card. Let's say, for example, your opponent plays Minotaur on turn 1. On your turn 1, playing a Stargirl may not be appropriate because they can just run the Minotaur into the Stargirl, and then they're left with a 3-1, and you've just thrown away your Stargirl. Even a situation like that is contextual. There might be a reason for you to do that. Maybe you have a way of dealing 1 damage to the Minotaur. Like, for example, maybe you have an Amethyst to use the following turn, which can finish off that Minotaur. So everything is contextual, but keep in mind your limited chances to actually play cards in the game. Deck building. Deck building is a super deep topic. I'll lean towards brevity on this subject rather than detail because, again, there's just so much that you could possibly talk about here. You want a high number of silver cards in your deck because even though we can't start playing them until turn 3, they continue to be resource efficient throughout the entirety of the game because you cap out at 1 gold, 1 silver, so there'll always be a time where you can efficiently use a silver resource. Bronze cards lose their efficiency as soon as turn 4, and gold cards are unplayable up until turn 5. Obviously, all of that is excluding any external card effects. People often want me to give them a rough ideal resource curve, but I absolutely refuse to do this. There is probably some ideal baseline, but whatever that baseline is won't be practical for most decks. Every single leader in the game or combination of leaders in the game will encourage you to run a lower or higher resource curve. For example, you can run a much higher number of bronze cards in a deck that has a green arrow leader, because a green arrow can generate you trick arrows to efficiently use your resources later in the game. Even if I only have one silver card in my hand on turn 4 as a green arrow player, I can always use my green arrow effect to generate an extra silver resource card. Doesn't even really matter what arrow that is, as long as I'm efficiently using that resource. And the same thing goes for later in the game. I don't need a high number of gold cards in a green arrow deck because I can take advantage of the really high value gold trick arrows. So on turns where you would otherwise be inefficient with your resources, you can be very efficient with your resources as the green arrow player. It won't always be necessary, but when it is, it's a big difference maker. As far as which factions to go, I'm not going to tell you to play a specific faction, though if you are starting off with deck building, Might has a lot of really good free-to-play options. I'd encourage you to focus on 2 factions though. While the game does give you the flexibility of being able to just build any combination of leaders, you don't need to have 2 factions. You can build what is commonly referred to as a mono deck. You can build mono tactics, you can build mono might, you can build, mono tyranny. The game offers you that flexibility, but generally you'll be sacrificing some amount of synergy by going into mono as opposed to having 2 factions. The game is designed in such a way that there are synergies across the different factions, so in most cases you'll be missing out rather than gaining something by going into mono. There are exceptions to this. For example, I think Cyborg's most fitting home right now is actually a mono tactics deck. So even though it isn't a hard rule, generally speaking, I would say avoid mono lists, especially as you're learning the game. You might pick up a handful of bad deck building habits if you're building mono decks, because building a mono deck is very different than building a dual faction deck. The Mulligan. The optimal Mulligan is going to vary from deck to deck, but if we consult our earlier theory in the video about action economy, we know that we would want to have access to at least 4 bronze cards between turn 1 and 4. As a result, we should keep most bronze cards in our opening hand. Not all bronze cards are made equal though. For example, take something like Super Strength. It's a good card, but it's not a card we can play on turn 1. So if our opening hand is something like Super Strength and 3 silver cards, I'm probably going to mulligan the whole hand. Even though that Super Strength is going to be good between turn 1 and 4, it's not going to be good on turn 1, and I know I need the card to be able to play on turn 1. As for silver cards, I'd toss almost all of them unless they are exceptionally impactful on turn 3. For example, the Culling, Mirror, and Lucius Fox are all really important cards for their respective decks, so keeping them in your hand despite their cost is going to be worth it in most situations. Very occasionally, and I mean very occasionally, I would say keeping a gold card in your hand is at least worth considering if that gold card results in very swingy turns. If you were running a very aggressive might deck, and you run like no other gold cards, maybe like one other gold card, keeping Truth and Justice could be worth it depending on the matchup, depending on the scenario, and depending on the other cards in your hand, just because that card can create such a big swing for you on turn 5. And I'll say this one more time before we move on to the next topic. Mulligan concepts are going to be very different from deck to deck, and even these broad concepts might dramatically change based on the current meta. But at least right now, it's the 20th of July at the time of me recording this, that's what I have to say about mulliganing. Leader charge. Leader abilities are a huge part of DC Dual Force, and understanding when to use them and how to react to them is super important. Let's first focus on how to use them. Just because you have enough charge to use your leader ability does not mean it's the appropriate time to use it. If you can clear the board without using your leader ability and without making your own board too vulnerable to whatever you expect the opponent's follow-up turn to be, holding on to that leader ability and using it as kind of this constant threat that the opponent has to worry about is often cases going to be more valuable than actually using it. This isn't necessarily true for every ability in the game. For example, you might as well use Green Arrow or Zatanna's ability as soon as you're able to, just because it's an extra card in your hand and you're not really committed to playing the card that you generate anyway. But even in that scenario where your leader ability is just a card generation tool, holding Zatanna or Green Arrow's ability could even be beneficial if you don't need to use that card that turn. Let's run through a hypothetical. Your opponent has no recruits on board, they don't have any leader abilities coming up, and we've used Green Arrow's effect. Here are our 3 options. It's turn 5 already, so you don't have to worry about resources. Which is the correct answer? Which arrow should we take? Well, the correct answer is probably that we just don't have enough context in this hypothetical. But in theory, I'd feel obligated to select the silver electrifying arrow as opposed to the titanium repeating arrow, which I suspect most of you probably selected the titanium repeating arrow. The reason I'd feel obligated to select the electrifying arrow is because if I was to top deck a gold card, picking the repeating arrow would mean I'm limited to just playing one of those 2 cards. Where if I pick the electrifying arrow, I know that any card I top deck I can play. Even if it's gold card, silver card, bronze card, I know I'm not limited next turn. Where if I selected the repeating arrow and I top decked a gold card, now I have to choose one. Where if I held green arrow's ability for the following turn, when I'll actually have the resources to be able to play the card, I'll have more context over the board, the hand, and how many resources my opponent has available to them the following turn. More context is always better for evaluating which card you select from green arrow's ability, and the same thing goes for Satana. So even in their cases, holding your ability can be important. As you get better at the game, though, this concept will be less important because you should have a general idea of what the game's going to play out like once you're in those later stages of the game anyway. As for enemy leader abilities, keep an eye out for their big swing turns. Aquaman is going to trigger every 3 turns, with the exception of charge effects like Steve Trevor or Dual Force. You already know that that 3-turn interval is going to result in a big tempo swing, so preparing for that is incredibly important. Similarly, let's say for example we have something in our hand like Naomi. Playing that while the enemy Batman is at 1 charge isn't just risky, you might as well discard the card from your hand. Because as soon as it passes to the enemy's turn, they're going to use Batman's ability, they're going to clear it, and they're going to have no problem with dealing with that scenario. Again, these are just broad guidelines, because there's even a potential scenario where you might want to play that Naomi just to get them to use the Batman ability, so your follow-up turn is a little bit more safe. Maybe you play Naomi on turn 2 so that they use the Batman ability to clear it, and then the following turn you do something like, I don't know, John Constantine plus I don't know, Amethyst to buff those 2 up, and now those 2 characters are more safe than they would otherwise be because you use the Naomi to get them to waste the Batman ability. You really got to think about when the opponent's ability is active, how you're going to get them to use that ability in the least efficient way possible. Concealing information from your opponent is going to be a big part of that. I won't be able to cover every possible scenario, so I kind of just have to say, keep an eye on their ability, try to picture what the board state's going to look like both before and after they use their ability, and that will lead to you making better turns. Leader health. This segment is just here to remind you that your leader's defense values are simply a resource. As long as your leader's defense value is above 1, there's no difference between 1 and 20. So often so, I'll be in a situation where I'm at like, I don't know, 10 health, and someone in Twitch chat says something like, why aren't you using your bandages to heal, I don't know, Batman from 10 to 13? Both Batman the Recruit and Lucius Fox turn bandage into a draw card. Cyborg lets bandage be a key important piece of removal. Now there are important thresholds to keep in mind. I know, for example, if I'm versing Mono Anarchy, that they're probably going to be running Bazooka, they're probably going to be running Black Manta, and they're probably going to be running Mr. Freeze. Let's say I've already KO'd their Harley Quinn. So they're in a top deck scenario, they can only play 1 card per turn. I know that as long as my health is greater than 8, I can't die in a single turn, because Bazooka is going to be their main way of pushing for damage. So as long as I'm above 8, I'm okay. If they have 2 cards to play for turn, that threshold becomes 13, because the most damage they can get out of 2 cards is going to be a Bazooka plus Black Manta. I don't have to worry about double Bazooka because they're gold cards, so they're not going to be able to play Bazooka. So again, 13 is that threshold. Let's follow down that same line. Let's say I'm at 14 health and the opponent plays Black Manta on their turn, doesn't kill me, they just play Black Manta, and now I go down to 9 health. Well, now I'm going to be more inclined to use bandage. Not necessarily because it saves me from a second Black Manta plus Bazooka, but it does save me from a Bazooka Mr. Freeze combo, because Bazooka Mr. Freeze would be 11 damage, and using a bandage to go from 9 to 12 would save me from that Mr. Freeze Bazooka combo. And obviously these specific numbers are going to change from matchup to matchup. The amount of burst damage Anarchy can put out is significantly higher than the amount of burst damage that, say, Tyranny can put out. But try to keep in mind roughly how much damage you think the opponent can do with a single turn, and try to play around that specific number rather than being overly cautious. Even playing around the maximum number you think the opponent can put out is, in some cases, a little too cautious. In fact, I would say in most scenarios, it's probably a little too cautious. In a lot of cases, you'd probably rather make a play that puts you in lethal range to something like Bazooka plus Black Manta, as long as that play also leads to you winning the game more often than they'll draw that exact combo. Black Manta plus Bazooka is just a 2-card combo that exists in their deck. Deck sizes are 40 in this game. It's pretty hard to draw that exact 2-card combo, especially if they're in a top deck scenario. You know, this gets into another concept of hand tracking. If they've been holding onto 1 card throughout the entire game, and you keep in mind that they haven't played that 1 card, they've had that card in their opening hand, they haven't played it this whole game, you might reasonably conclude that that card might be a Bazooka. But outside of scenarios like that, let's say again they're top decking, putting ourselves in lethal range to a 2-card combo like that is not that big of a deal, especially if it leads to a board state that lets us win the game in just a couple turns. I just want to go over one more thing: common removal tools. Every single faction has their own common removal tools, but I'm going to show you all of the removal tools for each faction as we sit here and talk. They're going to be showing up on a slideshow that you already see. As you verse these factions, keeping in mind that these cards exist, similar concepts to what we talked about before with managing your leader health also applies to managing your recruit health against these removal tools. There might be a trade that looks efficient on your board. You take that trade and now you're vulnerable to an energy blast that recruit otherwise wouldn't be vulnerable to. Or maybe that trade wasn't so efficient in the first place. Maybe there was a better trade to take. Maybe there was a way to set up your board state in such a way that they can only use energy blast in an inefficient way. These are things to keep in mind as you control the board state and as you think about the game. Okay. I think I covered every possible thing I could have thought to have covered in this video, so I hope that you enjoyed. I hope you learnt something. Keep being awesome. Go download Dual Force, and I'll catch you in the next one.